The first time she stepped off the coach in San Miguel Ridge, folks didn't even try to hide their snickers. It wasn't the patched dress or the trunk with a busted hinge. It was the man who wasn't there to meet her, a mail-order bride, all the way from Kansas, standing alone while men hawked spit and muttered, "She'll be dead by January." By sunset, they were laughing louder because she didn't head to town, didn't knock on a cabin door, didn't even ask for shelter. She hitched her skirts, turned toward the canyon, and vanished between the rocks. Nobody knew her name yet, but by the time the snow melted come spring, they'd be telling stories about the cave bride, stories twisted with guilt and awe. Because while the wind tore through their cabins and stoves froze solid, the woman they mocked, she lived warm. Her name was Hattie Wren, and she'd come west to marry a man already buried 3 months in the dirt. The letter had come in June. Mr. Levi Harrow seeks a God-fearing bride of able back and plain manner, suited for mountain winters and hard ground. Hattie's stepfather read it aloud in the sod house kitchen, spitting chaw into the stove grate as he smirked. Sounds like a lonely fool, but Hattie had known better. She saw the neat handwriting, the careful wording. A man who built sentences like that wasn't a drunk. He'd made a good offer, train fare, land promised, a root cellar already dug, more than she could ever hope for staying. She wrote back. She packed her sewing kit, her mother's Bible, the small coal stove from her mother's dowry. By late September, she was in the back of a freighter's wagon, rumbling towards San Miguel Ridge. What she didn't know, what the postman hadn't known either, was that Levi Harrow had fallen from a ladder in July, split his head on his own chopping stump. The homestead papers sat unsigned, unpaid, the wagon team sold off, and the half-built cabin now sat wind-stripped and rotting by the tree line. No one sent word back east, so Hattie arrived to marry a ghost in a town too proud to pity her. She found the cave that first night. It wasn't luck, it wasn't fate. It was the map Levi had drawn in his third letter, the one with a sketch of the canyon bend and the square mark labeled Winter Shelter. She found it by moonlight, half hidden behind scrub oak and shale. From the outside, it looked like nothing, just a dark cleft in a bluff face. But Hattie had seen sod houses collapse in Kansas. She'd seen floorboards buckle in storms. And when she stepped into that stone hollow and felt the sudden hush, the thick heat lingering in the rocks, she knew this would hold. The air inside was close and dry, deep enough to muffle wind, high enough to stand. The ceiling sloped like a chapel roof, narrow at the back, widening near the mouth. A shallow pit hinted where Levi must have dug before he died. The stone walls were already scorched black with soot. He must have spent time here last winter, testing it. Maybe it was meant for both of them. Maybe this was his final gift. She unrolled her blanket and slept on stone with a heart full of ice. By morning, the town had decided her fate. At the feed store, they shook heads. She'll crawl back begging before frost sets in. At the saloon, they joked, if the coyotes don't eat her, the snow will. Nobody sent help. Nobody offered wood. A few of the wives whispered sympathy behind curtains, but none dared open their doors. Sheriff Amos Granger rode up to the bluff once. Just once. In mid-October, after someone mentioned smoke trailing from the rocks. He found Hattie crouched by a stone-lined pit fire, hands raw, face flushed. She was melting snow in an iron pot and drying clothes by a homemade wire line. "You ain't got a roof," he'd said, puzzled more than angry. "I got 4. Hattie answered, touching the cave walls. "They just ain't made of pine." He'd tipped his hat and ridden off. That winter, 22 families in San Miguel Ridge braced for the coldest front in years. The ranchers buried fence lines under snow. Woodpiles vanished in a week. Stoves cracked. Babies shivered in their cradles, wrapped in flour sacks and cotton rags. And up in the bluff, the woman they mocked lived by steady warmth. Her cave held heat like a kiln. Her coals never died overnight. She built shelves from driftwood, a bed frame of scavenged fence posts. When the wind howled outside, it passed right over her. She stitched quilts from scrap, boiled stew from dried beans and tallow. Her mother's Bible stayed open on the shelf, not for prayer. Hattie didn't talk much to God anymore, but for pages she'd learned to line her boots with. They kept the cold from seeping through. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't proper, but it worked. What folks couldn't know, what Hattie never told, was that she'd grown up colder than any mountain winter. After her mother died in childbirth, the sod house back in Kansas had gone quiet. Her stepfather drank himself stupid, spent the winters with whores and his fists. Hattie learned to trap field mice, to boil wheat husks, to twist old wool into mittens. She didn't fear cold, she feared men. That's why she wrote Levi. That's why she trusted a stranger's letter more than her own blood. He'd seemed decent, and when he died, she wasn't about to beg mercy from the kind of men who grinned when she walked by. They'd built cabins with gaps in the walls, stoves that smoked, glass windows that shattered under ice. But Hattie Hattie had chosen stone. She dug deep that winter, both in the cave and in herself, reinforced the fire pit with clay she packed by hand, stacked rocks into a venting wall that pulled smoke back. She wove rugs from old flour sacks and lined the cave mouth with oiled canvas. She even rigged a catchment trough from snowmelt that trickled through a crack in the bluff. Clean water, filtered and slow. The inside stayed a steady 60 to 80 degrees, even in blizzards. When 2 families lost children to lung fever in February, folks stopped laughing. By March, they came knocking. The first was Eliza McCree, widow of the lumberman. Her son had frostbite so bad his toes turned black. She found Hattie's cave by smoke trail, stood outside for half an hour, ashamed. Hattie let her in, didn't ask questions. Then came the Baker twins, girls barely 13, whose pa had beaten them half senseless over a spilled stew pot. They arrived barefoot in a snowstorm, blue-lipped and bleeding. Hattie wrapped them in wool and fed them fried cornmeal. By month's end, 6 souls had taken shelter in the cave, and still it held. Hattie didn't ask for thanks. She didn't give sermons or speeches. She just tended the fire, stirred the stew, sewed bandages from torn slips. When the thaw came and the bluff bloomed with sage, Sheriff Granger rode up again. This time he brought supplies. "They say you saved half the hollow," he murmured, eyes on the girls playing outside the cave mouth. "They want to build you a cabin." Hattie looked past him, down toward the valley. Smoke curled from broken chimneys. Tarps flapped over splintered roofs. "I already got one," she said quietly. Come spring, the town changed. Folks still whispered, but with reverence now. They'd seen what held and what broke. And while no one carved her name into stone, they began to call that bluff Wren's Hold. Some even started carving into caves themselves, copying her vents, her fire pits. The warmth hadn't just come from stone. It had come from grit, from heartbreak, from a woman who refused to freeze. And while they still said it under breath, even the cruelest men admitted it. The cave bride had known what she was doing. She hadn't just survived. She'd outbuilt them all. By the time spring bled into the green hush of early summer, Wren's Hold was no longer a curiosity. It was a lesson. The town of San Miguel Ridge, once so eager to point and laugh, now glanced sideways up the bluff with something bordering on reverence. But reverence, in a place like this, always comes with suspicion riding close behind, especially when a woman's involved, especially when she succeeds where men failed. And though Hattie Wren didn't ask for attention, didn't seek praise, didn't parade through the church aisle with ribbons in her braid, attention found her anyway. In the dry months, in the spaces between planting and harvest, folks need stories. And Hattie, quiet and strange and warm through the winter, was a story the Ridge couldn't stop chewing on. "She's a witch," said Clara Vaughan to her sister at the market. "She's a survivalist," replied Miss Harper, the schoolmarm, who had once taught Latin in Boston before her husband's debts drove her west. "She's just lucky," growled Thomas Lathrop, whose third boy had coughed to death in February while their stovepipe clogged with soot and snow. But none of them really knew. None of them saw the nights Hattie lay awake, staring at the ceiling of stone, thinking of Levi's name etched into that unfinished cabin beam. None of them knew how many times she'd nearly run out of wood, how many times the fire dwindled to a fist-sized glow before she found a way to revive it, twisting fat wood, blowing through split bark, fingers cracked and numb. None of them saw how many things she had to let go of to stay warm. The Baker twins didn't leave right away. They stayed well into April, sleeping curled against one another like foxes, whispering to Hattie about how their father had chased them with an axe handle the night they fled. One had a bent arm that never quite straightened. The other barely spoke for weeks. They helped where they could, scrubbing pots, fetching water, stitching seams. But more than chores, they brought Hattie company. She wasn't used to voices at night, laughter near the fire, the soft brushing sound of hair being braided before sleep. Then Eliza McCree returned with a wooden box in her arms. Inside, 3 jars of blackberry preserves, 2 candles, and a hand-carved crucifix. "I don't have much," she said, eyes downcast. "But I wanted you to have something that don't burn." She placed the box gently near the back wall. Then she looked up, and her eyes were fierce. "You kept my boy's feet. No one else would have." From then on, Hattie couldn't walk through town without someone nodding stiffly, offering half-spoken thanks. She never asked for it. She only came down when she had to. Salt, needles, dried fruit, and always with her shoulders high and back straight, like she didn't notice the silence that fell when she entered the store. But she noticed. She noticed how the women watched her, not with friendship, but calculation. She noticed how the men, especially the unmarried ones, started lingering longer by the troughs when she passed. Some offered smiles, some offered more than that. "You're a wonder, Miss Wren," said Caleb Vaughan, taking off his hat. "Must be lonely up there with just rocks and wind." "I like rocks," she said, and walked past him. That only made the stories worse. The first real trouble came in June, when Hattie's name was scratched into the side of the church bell. Nobody ever found who did it, but it was there, Wren Witch, carved ragged in a boy's hand, visible just beneath the rope pulley. The preacher didn't address it, neither did the townsfolk, but everyone saw it. That Sunday, Hattie stood at the back of the church, bonnet in hand, eyes closed during the hymns. The Baker twins sat beside her, freshly bathed and dressed in patched gingham. When the sermon ended, nobody spoke to her. Nobody walked beside her. She went home the long way, alone. The next morning, she found a dead chicken outside her cave. Entrance, no note, just the neck twisted, the feathers torn. It hadn't been eaten, just killed and left. The twins cried when they saw it. Hattie didn't. She simply dug a hole, buried it beneath a cedar, and poured lye over the dirt. That night she set snares near the bluff mouth, not for animals, for men. She caught one. 2 nights later, just after moonrise, the wire trap jerked taut with a sharp metallic twang. Hattie lit her oil lamp and stepped into the cold. At the edge of the cave mouth, half hidden in shadow, a boy of about 15 writhed in the snare, one leg yanked tight above him, his face twisted with pain and fear. He wasn't from town, his coat was too worn, his boots cracked. A drifter's son, maybe, or one of the mountain squatters who lived off stolen hens and other people's lumber. "Don't kill me," he gasped. "I won't," she said, cutting him down. She gave him stew, cleaned the blood on his shin, and sent him on his way before dawn with a sack of dry cornbread and a warning. "If I see you again, you'll hang longer." He never came back, but word must have spread, because no more chickens showed up after that. By midsummer, the warmth inside the cave turned stifling. Hattie adapted, pulled back the canvas flap during the day, let the mountain air sweep through. She built a second fire pit just outside, for cooking when the inside grew too hot. She hauled in damp clay from the nearby creek and plastered the rear cave wall, sealing cracks that let in mildew. And still, she never once considered leaving. Not when Thomas Lathrop rebuilt his cabin with fresh oak, not when Clara Vaughan's youngest daughter married a merchant from Santa Fe and offered Hattie her old room, not when the preacher himself stopped by with a box of hymnals and an invitation to lead Sunday school. "Folks need reminding," he said gently, "that kindness breeds kindness." Hattie took the box, nodded, and never came. The second winter came early. By mid-October, the snows returned, dry at first, then wet, heavy, wind-pushed. The mountains groaned under the weight of it. Trees bent like old men. The cabins below filled with smoke again. More careful this time, more firewood stacked, but still vulnerable. That's when the first family came. The Morrows, parents and a toddler, showed up in sleet with blistered cheeks and a broken wagon axle. "We didn't want to impose," said the father, eyes hollow, "but they said you'd, well, make room." Hattie made room, laid hay down in the corner, pulled the Baker girls' quilt off their own bed, served potato mash and mutton. Then came an old miner, sick with pneumonia. Then came a teacher and his brother, with frostbite on their toes. By December, 10 people lived in the cave, and it still held heat. Each night, Hattie kept the fires fed. She taught the others to seal drafts, to take turns stoking embers, to sleep tight-packed beneath stitched layers. The air grew smoky but not choking. The vents worked. The stone drank heat and gave it back. When the thermometer at the general store cracked during a freeze, folks said it dropped below -30. At Wren's Hold, it never dipped below 58. But this time the town's gratitude curdled faster. Some called her a hoarder. "She's got more than enough food," muttered Lathrop at the store. "Heard she's still got salt pork from last May." Some called her dangerous. "Caves can collapse," warned the preacher. "It's no fit place for children, or the sick, not in such numbers." And some, especially the wives, began whispering something darker. "She keeps young men up there," they'd say, "alone, all night. She lets them in, but not us. She's building something, a life without us." They weren't entirely wrong, but they were also far from right. Hattie had built something, not just warmth, not just shelter, but a way of living that didn't kneel to the town's customs. She didn't take scraps from the store, didn't rely on a man's roof or a husband's name. She didn't ask permission, and that, more than the fire, more than the cave, more than anything, was what they feared. Because if a woman could survive without them, what else could she do? The real blow came in February. The Lathrop boy, 9 years old, red-cheeked, always sick, died of the croup. He'd been turned away from Wren's Hold just days before. His mother had stood at the cave mouth, begged for a place, but Hattie Hattie's cave was full. 3 more had arrived that week, one with typhoid symptoms. "I'm sorry," Hattie had said. "It's not safe. Not for them. Not for you." The mother had cursed her, called her a devil, said she'd see Hattie strung up before spring, and now the boy was buried beneath 5 feet of snow, his grave marked with a crooked stick. That Sunday, Hattie didn't go to church. She knew what would be waiting. The whispers turned to threats. Then, one night in March, the fire came, a bottle of oil, a rag, a flick of flame, thrown against the cave mouth while the wind was high. The canvas flap caught fast, and in moments the entrance burned bright. Inside, the children screamed. Hattie grabbed a pail, then another. She shoved the others back, coughing, dragging quilts across the entrance to smother the blaze. Eliza McCree grabbed snow with her bare hands, threw it against the flame until her knuckles split. It worked, barely. The entrance was scorched, the wood charred, but the inside held, and once again, the cave stayed warm. They never caught who did it. Hattie didn't ask. She simply reinforced the mouth with stone slabs, built a barrier that would not burn. She taught the children to escape through the back crack, a narrow passage no one else knew. She slept with a rifle at her side after that. But she didn't run. She never ran. By the thaw of Hattie's second winter in Wren's Hold, the cave no longer felt like a secret. It felt like a target. Where once it had been a refuge hidden among stone and silence, now it had become a legend made loud. Whispers about it traveled farther than she ever expected, south through the trading posts, east along the old military trail, and north through the high country herders who passed the bluff and saw smoke spiraling in the cold. But when something works too well, and especially when it's built by someone folks don't understand, a woman, a stranger, a widow who answers to no one, it stirs something bitter in men who've built their names on failure. And come the third spring, that bitterness didn't just take root. It came knocking, not with fire this time, not with snide looks or hushed insults in the churchyard. This time, it wore a smile and a badge. Sheriff Amos Granger rode up to Wren's Hold on the first warm day of April, hat in hand, horse sweat-damp, coat stiff with dust. He wasn't alone. 3 men rode behind him, 2 ranchers from the North Valley, and a lean stranger with sunburned eyes and a lawyer's coat buttoned all the way to his throat. Hattie saw them long before they reached the cave. She'd built a lookout perch on the high ridge, a place where she could sit with a tin scope and watch the trail. She'd seen too many shadows come too close over winter not to take precautions. She met them outside the bluff entrance, hands raw from laundry, hair pinned back, skirts soot-smudged. "Sheriff," she said flatly, "didn't expect callers." He cleared his throat and dismounted, squinting toward the shaded entrance behind her. "Heard you've got over a dozen people staying here now," he said. "4 left last week," she said. "The Harpers found a room in town." One of the ranchers grunted. The lawyer stepped forward and opened his satchel. "Miss Hattie Wren," he said formally, "you are hereby notified of an order of evacuation, signed by Judge Talcott of the San Miguel Municipal District, citing unsafe habitation and violation of unregulated residency ordinances." Hattie blinked. "Unregulated? There's concern," the man continued, "that the structure you occupy, while impressive, is not compliant with safety standards for group dwellings, especially in light of the recent fire. Additionally, claims have been made regarding water rights and land use." She narrowed her eyes. "What claims?" The ranchers didn't speak, but the sheriff did. "Some folks say that stream you're piping into the cave, well, it cuts through Ferguson's plot down below. Technically, it's part of his pasture land runoff. He's claiming your trough diverts flow illegally." "Ferguson doesn't drink from that runoff," Hattie snapped. "No one does. It's full of tannins and ash. That stream floods seasonally and kills his sagebrush." "I ain't here to argue science," said the sheriff. "I'm here to deliver notice. Judge wants you out within 30 days. Hattie didn't move. "And if I don't go," the lawyer shifted, "then we send men to escort you and seal the cave for public safety." She glanced toward the stone mouth, where a boy's laughter echoed softly from inside. Jonah Morrow, 7 years old, running races with the Baker twins through the candlelit shadows. Sheriff Granger saw the look on her face. He sighed. "I ain't proud of this, Hattie," he said, "but the town's got rules, even if they're old ones, nobody cared about till now. Till I proved stone held better than wood." He didn't answer. They gave her 30 days. She used every one, not to leave, not to pack, but to fight. She rode down to Talcott's court herself, sat in the back, while 3 ranchers argued about water rights and occupancy caps. When the judge called her forward, she presented a packet, hand-drawn diagrams of the cave's structure, heat retention logs, names of every person who had sheltered there over 2 winters. She read them aloud, slowly, carefully. Jonah Morrow, age 7, survived frostbite. Annie and Bella Baker, orphans taken in after abuse. Eliza McCree, widow, recovered from pneumonia. Robert Mackenzie, schoolteacher, saved from starvation. Helen Frey, pregnant, malnourished, birthed a living son in that cave while snow buried the ridge for 9 days straight. My hands caught him. His first breath came not in a barn or cabin, but in a fire-warmed stone shelter carved by a dead man's dream and a living woman's back. The courtroom was silent, but Judge Talcott simply rubbed his temple. "The law isn't about poetry, Miss Wren," he muttered. "It's about precedent." Word spread that week. Some townsfolk came to her defense. Miss Harper wrote an editorial in the Ridge Watcher, calling Wren's hold the only proof that human grit can still outmatch this country's cruelty. Others weren't so kind. "She thinks she's better than us," Clara Vaughan spat. "Building kingdoms out of holes in the ground." "She's hoarding land," said Ferguson. "Land that could be worked proper if she'd move on." But Hattie didn't move on. Instead, she moved deeper. In the last week before the court's deadline, Hattie led the older children into the side crevice she'd only recently finished clearing. It was narrow, barely shoulder width, but after 10 feet it opened into a second chamber, one that caught heat like a kettle and curved upward in a natural dome. She called it the Heart Room. There she installed shelves, tucked away seed stores and canned goods, folded quilts from every child who had lived through winter under her roof. She burned a pattern into the wall, an old mark from her mother's folk stitching. A reminder, hold fast, stay warm. Then she wrote letters, one to Miss Harper, explaining where the spare keys were, one to Eliza, naming her guardian of the children if things went wrong, one to the judge himself. In it, she didn't argue law. She simply enclosed a photograph, one taken by a passing surveyor last spring, showing the cave's interior, the children gathered in warmth, a fire glowing behind them. She captioned it in ink, "This is what your laws call unfit." The night before the removal was scheduled, a storm rolled in. Not snow this time, rain, thunder, spring's vengeance after 2 long years of ice. The sheriff didn't ride up, neither did the ranchers, but 2 other people did. First, Miss Harper, bonnet soaked, breath hitching. "They're going to send men in the morning," she said. "Armed ones. They'll force you out." Hattie nodded. "I know." Then came Eliza. No words. Just a crate of tinned food and a folded scrap of paper with 5 other names. Women who'd help, quietly, from the shadows. "We'll stall them," she whispered, "as long as we can." At dawn, Hattie woke the children and dressed them in their thickest clothes. "Don't cry," she told the youngest. "This isn't the end." Then she led them into the heart room, sealed the passage with a false stone wall she'd crafted over months, covered it with soot, hung a curtain of woven sagebrush for scent. She left one candle flickering low, hidden behind a metal grate for safety, enough light to wait. Then she turned back alone and stood at the mouth of Wren's hold as the first riders appeared on the trail below. There were 6 of them. Deputies, 2 from town, 4 from downriver, hired hands. Only the sheriff rode slow. "Miss Wren," he called out, "don't make this hard." She stepped forward. "I'll come," she said. "No need to drag me." They cuffed her anyway, didn't speak. The sheriff looked ashamed, but he didn't stop them. As they led her down the bluff, she didn't resist. Her eyes never left the ridge. Behind her in the shadowed cave, not a sound came from the hidden room. "They locked her in the town jail. 30 days, the judge declared, for obstruction, for resisting order, for failure to comply. They gave her bread and water, a cot with a straw mattress, a single blanket that stank of mold. She endured, but word traveled faster than chains. Within a week, every mother who'd ever sent her child to Wren's hold began speaking, quietly at first, then louder. Eliza, Miss Harper, even the preacher's wife. "She saved mine. She took us in. She did what no one else dared." By the 3rd week, the jailhouse had a crowd outside. By the 4th, the judge couldn't sleep. By the 5th, he dropped the charges. When Hattie stepped out, the sun was high. Her dress hung looser. Her eyes looked older, but her back was still straight. They offered her a cabin, said she could live near the schoolhouse, said they'd forgive the past. She declined. "Is my cave still standing?" she asked the sheriff. He didn't answer, so she walked. When she reached the bluff, she feared the worst. Stones toppled, entrance sealed, shelves looted, but instead, she found a miracle. Eliza had kept watch. Miss Harper had cleaned. Even Clara Vaughan, red-faced and silent, had helped restore the fire pit. But best of all, the children still waited. Jonah Morrow ran to her first. "I kept the candle lit," he whispered. "Just like you said." She held him tight, and then, without a word, she stepped back inside. The air was warm, still. The cave stayed warm through a 3rd brutal spring thaw, even as most of the valley slogged through mudslides and cabin rot. San Miguel Ridge had been built by men who believed in boards and beams, in 4-corner rooms with glass windows, and gapped roofs patched each year with desperation and prayer. But Wren's hold, Hattie's cave, had never leaked a drop, and now it stood, once again, unbroken, stronger than ever. Hattie stepped back into it with the sun on her shoulders and town dust still in her boots, the weight of jail behind her, and a new weight settling on her chest. Survival was no longer enough. Now they knew her name. Now they knew her face. Now they couldn't ignore what she'd built. The cave had outlived their pity, their suspicion, their laws, and it was only a matter of time before someone tried to own it. They came quietly at first, one by one, always with smiles. "Miss Wren," said Mr. Dewey from the supply post, "I've a buyer from Pueblo who'd give a fair sum for that bluff. You could settle down proper with the coin." She declined. Then Ferguson again. "You and I could split the pasture line, carve a better route for the runoff, turn the ridge into a winter camp." She declined. Then men she didn't recognize, surveyors with clean boots and city voices, one with a roll of maps, one with a mining stake. "We've reason to believe the bluff contains usable limestone," said the younger one. "We could offer you $20 a foot." Hattie looked him dead in the eye and said, "The bluff contains memories. Try drilling through those." He didn't return, but his papers did. The letter came by post, unsealed, folded once, tucked under a wrapped parcel of nails and buttons from the general store. It bore the wax mark of the Territorial Development Authority. Claim dispute in process. Land marked for pending review due to mineral rights under Clause 8C. Submit documentation or vacate within 90 days. Hattie read it at dusk beside the main fire. The children watched her face. "What does it mean?" asked Jonah. "It means they think this land is worth something now," she said, "and they want it." She knew then the warmth alone would never be enough. The stone could hold fire. It could hold people. It could hold silence. But it couldn't hold off a government hungry for its own kind of permanence. So she began preparing, not to flee, not to fight, but to anchor, because Wren's hold wasn't just a shelter anymore, it was a legacy. Over the next month, Hattie called in every favor she'd never asked for. She wrote to Miss Harper, asking her to draft affidavits from every soul who had lived in the cave. She sent the Baker twins into town with stitched pouches filled with tiny polished stones, tokens of each winter spent there, each gifted in exchange for written testimony, what the cave had meant, what it had saved. She even approached Clara Vaughan. "I'm not here for friendship," she said bluntly. "I'm here for truth." Clara's jaw worked, bitter. Then she nodded. "My sister spent a night there last winter, when her baby was dying. You let her in, fed her, no questions. She didn't tell anyone. She was afraid it would make my family look weak." "I understand." Clara took the paper, signed it, said nothing more. Word reached Santa Fe. A lawyer wrote back, "Your case lacks traditional deed ownership. However, if communal benefit and sustained occupation can be proven, precedent exists for homestead exception under Clause 2.4b. Land improved by acts of good faith and public service in unincorporated zones." It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a crack in the wall, and Hattie had learned to split stone with less. So she filed her claim, under the name Wren's Hold, not as a property, not as a mine, as a community structure of humanitarian shelter. And then she did something that no one in San Miguel Ridge expected. She invited them up. All of them. Every man, woman, child. Not just the ones who liked her. Not just the ones who owed her. All of them. She sent handwritten invitations delivered by the Morrow boy and the twins, wrapped in twine with bits of dried lavender. "Open fire, warm bread, one night only. See for yourself what cannot be written." They laughed at first. Some mocked. But curiosity eats pride faster than famine ever did. And on that spring night, as the first stars peeked out over the canyon, nearly 40 townsfolk made the climb to the bluff. Some came in wagons, some walked. Sheriff Granger stood by the path, silent as they passed. Miss Harper led the way with a lantern. Even Ferguson showed, whiskey on his breath, scowl buried under a well-trimmed beard. What they found inside silenced them. The cave had changed. Gone were the rough cloth curtains and makeshift shelves. In their place stood solid benches, carved from sandstone, smooth as bone, hanging racks for dried goods, a chimney of shaped rock that pulled smoke upward so cleanly that even the babies didn't cough. Candles glowed in glass jars. Quilts stitched from dozens of hands lined the walls, names etched into a slab near the fire pit, each one of them carved carefully, in a growing spiral that ended with a small copper plate reading, "Here we stayed warm. Here we stayed human." No speeches were made. Hattie simply handed out bowls of bean stew, thick, with lard and onion, cornbread still steaming from the firestone, tea brewed from pine needles and a sprig of mint. She said nothing, neither did Eliza, nor the twins. But Miss Harper stood at the entrance as they left, voice clear. "This isn't a cave, it's a promise, and if the law wants to break it, they'll have to explain why warmth is illegal." 3 days later, the territorial authority sent a new letter. Homestead, exception pending investigation. Freeze on development orders until further notice. It wasn't victory, but it was time. And time, Hattie had learned, was everything. Summer turned to fall. Leaves fell like slow rain. Hattie took in fewer guests now. Not out of bitterness, but purpose. She built a system. 3 weeks max. Shelter, not permanence. Those who healed moved on, but always with instruction. Take what you learned. Build your own warmth. In September, she helped the Baker twins dig their own fire trap pit beneath a cliffside hollow east of the river. By October, they'd taken in their first shivering traveler, a boy with a cough and no family. They named their place Ember End. In November, Eliza and 2 other women began gathering old bricks from a collapsed chimney and forming heat walls under the preacher's old barn. Miss Harper called it Ash Chapel, and slowly, without speeches or fanfare, the valley began to change. They didn't laugh anymore, they built. And as the first snow returned, soft as breath, Hattie stood outside Wren's hold one last time before sealing it for winter. The heart room was stocked, the vents cleared, the quilts freshly aired. Jonah Morrow, now nearly 10, had taken to carving small stone figures in his spare time. One sat near the fire, a woman holding a candle, her face worn smooth by thumb and time. "Looks like you," he said. "Looks like all of us," she replied. That night, as the wind howled against the ridge and the town lights flickered below, Wren's hold stayed warm, 80 degrees, steady, still. By the time the 4th winter came, no one called her the Cave Bride anymore. They called her Miss Wren, Miss Hattie. Sometimes just "Ma'am," said low and careful, the way one might greet a woman who buried 2 winters' worth of hardship with her bare hands and still kept a fire going for strangers. What started as pity had become folklore. What began as mockery had become a blueprint. And yet in the quiet hollow of her cave, in the heart of stone that had held the warmth of grief and kindness alike, Hattie Wren felt a new storm coming. Not of snow, but of choice. Because even legends reach a point where they must decide whether to rest or keep growing. The 5th winter was the warmest in years. Temperatures hovered in the 20s. Ice melted off eaves faster than it could gather. For the first time since she'd arrived, Hattie looked out across the valley and saw chimneys puffing clean, steady smoke. She saw glass windows, without cracks, children wearing mittens sewn from wool instead of stuffed flour sacks. She saw imitation. Ridge families had copied her methods. Fire trap pits, earth-stuffed walls, windscreens made of sagebrush and waxed canvas. Even the stubborn Lathrops had retrofitted their smoke vents after one of the Baker twins drew them a diagram in the dirt. The townspeople didn't speak of it directly, but they nodded now. When she walked into the store, they stepped aside at the water pump. No more mutters, no more glares. They had learned, even if they hadn't admitted where the lessons came from. But imitation brings its own consequence. Now they felt they didn't need her. And Hattie, for the first time since stepping into Levi Harrow's old sketch of a cave, began to ask, what happens to the teacher once everyone stops listening? The children had all grown. Jonah was nearly as tall as Hattie now, hands calloused from helping on the McCree homestead. He still visited often, bringing dried apples, carved trinkets, wood shavings in his boots. The Baker twins had started their own small school near Ember End, using Hattie's cave journals as teaching aids. How to trap heat with stone, how to split pitch for smoke control, how to keep a fire breathing through the night without wasting fuel. Eliza had remarried, a quiet man, scar-faced, older, a former trapper, who'd lost his leg to frostbite before Hattie ever came west. He built her a home with thick walls and no chimney, just a draw vent system copied straight from Wren's hold. Even Miss Harper had moved on, off to Taos to teach Latin to the daughters of bankers and furriers. She wrote twice a year, each letter folded with a pressed flower and a poem scribbled along the edge. Hattie kept them in a box beneath the hearthstone. The cave had grown quiet again, but this time not from loneliness, from fulfillment, which is why the letter from Kansas hit her harder than she expected. It came in a yellowed envelope, sealed in wax, postmarked from Atchison County. The return name read Walter M. Wren. She sat with it on her lap for 3 hours before opening it. Inside, a single page, shaky handwriting, sparse punctuation, but unmistakably real. Hattie, they said you was still alive. Heard from a freighter passed through Ridge. Said he met a woman with your Firestone ring and your mother's shawl. I've been a bastard. I know. If you get this, come home. The sod house is broke. Ain't no one left but me and silence. I owe you a grave. Maybe more. I owe you a thank you too. You turned into someone. Come home if you want. If you don't, I understand. She read it twice, then burned it in the stove, not out of anger, but because the past had no place in stone. Still, something stirred in her after that. A restlessness, a sense that Wren's hold had given all it could. Not that it was finished, not that it was broken, but that maybe, its strength strength wasn't just in staying warm. It was in teaching others how to. Maybe it was time to leave the warmth to others. Maybe it was time to build something new. But first, she had to face the ridge again, one more time, to settle something that had never sat easy. She climbed down into town the day before the last big storm hit. The clouds were already bruised with snow. The wind had that high whistle to it, the kind that meant roofs would groan by midnight. She walked into the general store and placed a wrapped parcel on the counter. Inside, 10 pounds of smoked jerky, 4 sacks of root vegetables, 1 folded map. She waited. Ferguson came in first, then Sheriff Granger, then the preacher. All men who had, at one time or another, stood against her. Now they stood quiet. "What is it?" the sheriff asked. Hattie unwrapped the map. It showed Wren's Hold, Ember End, Ash Chapel, all drawn to scale, marked with notes, temperature logs, fire pit diagrams, shelter metrics, a ledger of survival. "You gave me notice once," she said, "to vacate. I never forgot that. So I'm giving you notice now." The preacher frowned. "Of what?" She met his eyes. "I'm leaving." Silence. Then Ferguson scoffed. "You're bluffing." "No, I'm passing it on." She placed a key on the map, carved from bone, smooth with use. "There's a boy, 17. His name's Elias Pike. He lost his parents last summer. He's been sleeping in the woodshop behind the mill. You've seen him, ignored him. I'm giving him the cave." "You can't just give land," muttered Ferguson. "Neither could Levi Harrow. But here we are." She turned to the sheriff. "Elias has been keeping the fire pit going for 3 weeks now. He's got the Baker twins teaching him vent work. Eliza's helping stock food. All he needs is the blessing, or the silence." Granger looked down at the key, then at her. Finally, he nodded. "I'll say nothing." Hattie nodded back. Then she turned and walked out into the snow. She left the next morning. No parade, no farewell. Just a pack with 3 blankets, a jar of ash, her mother's Bible, and the last letter she would ever write. She left it by the fire, beneath a flat stone, where the next keeper would find it. It read, "Wren's Hold is not mine. It never was. It is yours now. Feed it, clean it, respect it. It will outlive all of us. Keep it warm. H. Wren." The trail west was cruel that year. Snowdrifts up to the knee, ice on the wind. But Hattie had known worse. She traveled slow, stayed off main roads, slept in hollows, shared warmth with goats and dogs and strangers who didn't recognize her. She passed through Santa Fe by mid-spring, down through Las Cruces by summer. By fall, she'd reached the Rio. Farmland stretched golden in all directions. She kept walking until she found a place that called to her, a narrow gorge, hidden, south-facing, windless. Inside, a shallow cave, smaller than Wren's Hold, but with a flat floor and a chimney crack. Water trickled nearby. She stepped inside, lit a match, listened. It held. Years later, when riders passed through that stretch of land and stopped at the woman's cave for warmth, they'd notice a stone shelf carved with strange symbols, a map etched into the floor, a spiral of names curling inward, like some secret code. They'd call her the Hollow Queen, the Widow of Fire, the Stone Woman. They'd tell stories, some true, some not. They'd say she built a kingdom of caves across the west. They'd say she had no children but taught 1,000 how to stay warm. They'd say she was born in the stone. They'd say she never died, just faded back into the rocks. But no one ever laughed again, not once. Because somewhere, out beyond the snow and silence, the warmth still burned, and it always would.